We're going to look at Genesis chapter 18, which I've called Truth, Justice and the Abrahamic Way. Superman once walked into a bar with Batman, the Flash, Wonder Woman and Aquaman, and he ordered 5 whiskies on the rocks. He was asked, "Would you like any Coke or a slice of lemon in those?" And Superman replied, "No thanks, we are the Just Ice League." The Justice League is the stuff of fiction. And the phrase truth, justice and the American way also belongs in the world of fiction. This phrase introduced Superman radio and television programs, and it became an established phrase in the 1950s because of American paranoia and patriotism during the Cold War. And in the 1978 Christopher Reeve movie Superman, Lois Lane asks the Man of Steel why he is here, and he replies, "I'm here to fight for truth, justice and the American way." And this association of the American way with truth and justice is a bit of a joke following Watergate in 1972 and the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. And when it comes to truth and justice, it's not only America that has lost its way, but the entire Western world, as we're very much experiencing here in Australia. Central to the American way is the election of a person who has the ability to access millions upon millions of dollars to become the most influential and powerful person in the world. Now, we'd be fools to expect such a person to be the champion of truth and justice. In April 2011, DC Comics, in its 900th issue of Action Comics, has Superman telling America's National Security Advisor to tell the United Nations that he is renouncing his US citizenship because he is fed up with his actions being construed as instruments of US policy. And he adds, "Truth, justice and the American way, it's not enough anymore. The world's too small, too connected." Now, Genesis 18 is very much about truth and justice. It does not associate this with any species of patriotism, such as the American way, or the Australian way, or even the Jewish way. Rather, God himself connects truth and justice to the Abrahamic way. First of all, let's think about justice and truth as it is presented in this chapter. God appeared to Abraham when he first entered the land, and we're told that he also appeared to him not long before the events of Genesis 18, when Abraham turned 99 years of age. It's quite possible that he did so in human form, which he now does again, this time with 2 attendants. In the Old Testament, it is not at all unusual for God to appear in human form. In Genesis 3, we read that God walked in the Garden of Eden, presumably in human form. And this shouldn't surprise us, because God made us in his image. So while God, in his essential nature, is spirit and does not have a material form, it is highly appropriate that he should appear in the form he himself chose to represent him. And clearly we are also being well prepared for the most stupendous manifestation of God in human form that took place when the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us, when God lived among us in the person of Jesus, fully God, but also fully human. Now, this time when God appears to Abraham in Genesis chapter 18, there are 3 figures, but do not confuse this with the Trinity. We will see the 2 angels being sent to Sodom, and indeed it is clear to Abraham that his 3 visitors are en route to another destination. God is headed for Sodom to make sure justice is done. Just look at verses 20 to 21. God informs Abraham, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grievous, that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know." Obviously, God, being God, fully knows the situation already. But think back to Genesis 12, when God first committed himself to bless all peoples through Abraham and the great nation that he would form through his descendants. And remember, this is God's way of addressing human evil, a world subject to God's curse and death. And the central and primary way that God brings truth and justice into a world of deceit and injustice is through Abraham, the Abrahamic way. And this is why we see God involving Abraham in his deliberations. When the sins of Sodom move God to execute justice, he will not simply destroy Sodom in a direct manner without reference to Abraham. And Genesis 18 highlights an essential truth. Abraham must be part and parcel of what God will do in countering evil and bringing justice into the world. Now, Abraham needs to understand that God's justice is based on truth, knowing the real facts. As God says, I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know. And in Genesis 19, we will be brought face to face with the immensity of the evil in Sodom. But let's not be reductionist and assume that it is homosexual sin that has primarily caused such an outcry. Indeed, when we get to Ezekiel in chapter 16, we read, Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Therefore I did away with them, as you have seen. So there's a lot more going on here when we think about the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah than we might think. Now let's think about justice and Abraham then. How do these things connect? Well, in the previous chapter, Genesis 17, God confirmed his covenant with Abraham involving the sign of circumcision. And God's entire dealings with the world are now channeled through Abraham. So God's journey to bring justice begins with Abraham. And it's striking to see God and his attendant angels accepting Abraham's hospitality. Now clearly God does not need food. He's not tired and in need of rest and refreshment. But Abraham provides a substantial meal. A seah equates to 2 gallons or 8 litres of grain, and 3 seah was 6 gallons or 24 litres of flour for bread. Now that's an enormous amount of bread for just 3 visitors. So Abraham is not treating this as an ordinary visit. He also has a calf killed and prepared. Isn't it striking to see that God has no problem in eating the meat that Abraham provides? Just as Jesus had no problem cooking and eating fish after his resurrection. Once smart aleck equipped, turning vegan would be a mistake. However, if you happen to be a vegan, then that's okay if it's for dietary reasons, but you need to be pretty careful about trying to justify it on philosophical grounds given a background like we have here in Genesis 18. Now, why does God accept this hospitality? It is in response to Abraham's request. What he asks is this: if I have found favour in your eyes, if I've found favour in your eyes, O Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so you can be refreshed and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant. So God accepts this hospitality so that Abraham will know that he has indeed found favour in his eyes. Now, isn't it a wonderful thing to think of the creator of the universe sitting down with you and me to have a meal with us? And in the Gospels we constantly see Jesus having meals with people as a way of expressing his love, acceptance and forgiveness. And we're supposed to have a regular community meal, the Lord's Supper. And one of its key purposes is to constantly remind us that when the kingdom of God eventually comes in all its fullness, then our wonderful Lord will be our host at a sumptuous banquet. Now back in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 8 we read that Noah found favour with God. That's in the context of God's judgment on humanity through the flood. And now Abraham is compared to Noah as one who finds favour in the eyes of God. And yet again, it is in the context of God's judgment, this time on Sodom. And indeed in Genesis 19, as we will see, the judgment on Sodom is likened to the flood judgment. The language used there draws that parallel. Now God's primary way of addressing evil and bringing truth and justice will be through the great nation that he promised Abraham, and ultimately that's us, the church. It is because of God's commitment to justice that he reiterates his promise of Genesis 17 to return about the same time next year and bless Sarah with a son. Now, it's not difficult to see how the thought of Sarah having a child at her advanced age might raise a laugh. I mean, with all the new technology regarding fertility recently, a 65-year-old woman was able to give birth, and when she was discharged from the hospital and went home, her relatives came to visit. "May we see the new baby?" one asked. "Not yet," said the mother. "I'll make coffee and we can chat for a while first." And 30 minutes had passed, and another relative asked, "May we see the new baby now?" "No, not yet," said the mother. And after another few minutes had elapsed, they asked again, "May we see the baby now?" "No, not yet," replied the mother. Well, getting pretty impatient by this stage, they asked, well, when can we see the baby?" "When he cries," she told them. "When he cries?" they demanded. "Why do we have to wait until he cries?" "Because I forgot where I put him, okay?" Now, Sarah's pretty advanced in age, and she's laughing at the whole idea of having a son at her age. Sarah doubted she would have a son, and we might doubt that God would use a small insignificant church. After all, we are the great nation, aren't we? That God would use a small insignificant church to address evil and injustice all around us. And when we're on a world scale, of course, most of our churches, even if we think of them big in our particular context, are usually pretty small and insignificant by comparison. But God responds, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" So God's use of his people to bring blessing instead of curse all presupposes God's supernatural power at work through us, as though Sarah's aged body, as through that. Is anything too hard for the Lord? That's the question. So Abraham's guests, they rise to depart, and they look towards Sodom. And Abraham walks along with them, reminding us of Noah, who walked with God. And the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him, so that he will direct his children and his household after him, to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him." So it's imperative that God's exercise of justice should centrally involve Abraham himself, just as his exercise of justice today centrally involves his true people. And God only uses those who, like Abraham, are committed to directing their children to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. So we must be committed to justice in our own lives and families if we expect to be used by God in his exercise of justice in this world. And now we come to another key thing that's dealt with in this chapter, the issue of justice and forgiveness. Because God's way of executing justice in this world is the Abrahamic way, Abraham's involvement in the process is crucial. And Abraham illustrates for us that it is especially in prayer that we participate in the outworking of God's justice in this world. God has heard the cries, the pain, the immense suffering of people who are the victims of the evil things done in Sodom. And he continues to hear those cries right now. Now God's angelic attendants, they head for Sodom to assess whether the evil of Sodom and Gomorrah matches the outcry. Abraham remains standing before the Lord and approaches him. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right?" What is Abraham doing in these verses when he keeps reducing the number from 50 to 45 to 40 to 30 to 20 to 10? Now many preachers describe Abraham as haggling with God, daring to barter with God and trying to change his mind. Now is that really right? When I was in Pakistan, I'd go to the bazaar to buy something. I'd ask the shopkeeper how much it costs, and he might say 100 rupees. And I say, no, that's far too expensive. I'll give you 80 rupees for it. And he says, no, that's far too cheap. But I'll let you have it for 95 rupees. And I say, no, that's still too expensive. But I would be prepared to buy it for 85 rupees. And he says, no, 95 rupees is a good price, but I'll let you have it for 90 rupees, but no less. And I say, okay, I'll take it for 90 rupees. Now that's haggling, that's bartering. But do note very carefully that this is precisely what Abraham is not doing in his conversation with God. It's not haggling, it's not bartering. Abraham models what Martin Luther said. Prayer is not overcoming God's reluctance, it is laying hold of his willingness. Now Tim Keller has come to grips with what is really going on here in a way that few have recognised. Abraham asks, will you not spare Sodom for the sake of 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10 righteous people? And literally he is asking, will you not forgive the many for the sake of the righteous few? Now that's a profound question. So don't misunderstand what's happening here. God is just. God is righteous. And Abraham knows this. He knows that God cannot turn a blind eye to wickedness. So he's not pleading with God to overlook the evil in Sodom. Abram is asking God how much he values righteousness. Does God value the righteousness of the few so much that it covers the unrighteousness of the many? Is God prepared to spare and forgive a whole city because of a righteous remnant within it? Now, one reason Westerners misread what is going on here is because our culture is so individualistic and so concerned with individual human rights. We don't understand corporate responsibility. Yes, individual responsibility is important, but we all participate to some degree in what the group does. In the minds of Aboriginal Australians, white Australians are enjoying privileges that result from the unjust behaviour of their ancestors. Now they believe in corporate responsibility, white Australians don't. 2008 marked Kevin Rudd's sorry speech, and this speech included the following words: "We apologise for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on these our fellow Australians." But while such sentiments express regret for what was done in the past, they are a far cry from a sense of corporate responsibility. The fact is that most of us don't think we bear any personal responsibility for the atrocities committed against Aborigines by earlier generations. We think, I wasn't there, it's nothing to do with me. Now, unlike people in the West, most people in history, and still in most cultures, believe very much in corporate responsibility. The sins of others can fall on me and make me guilty, with the dire consequences that follow. Now we might recall here how Daniel prays in Daniel chapter 9. Now he was clearly a righteous man, and yet because he was inseparably part of the community of God's people, he identifies himself with the sins of his people and acknowledges the rightness of the terrible consequences which followed, which he himself has experienced. And if the sins of others can fall on me and make me guilty, bringing dire consequences, is it possible that the reverse is true? Is it possible that the righteousness of someone else with whom I am in solidarity would benefit me? Abraham is not bartering with God. By his questions, he is discovering that God is so gracious that even the presence of a very small number of righteous people could so please God that it would stem the judgment that would otherwise fall. This is how much God's will to save is over his will to punish. Now, Abraham's prayer is extraordinary. The absence of any mention of Lot in Abraham's prayer is highly significant. We might expect Abraham to pray that God would spare Lot and his family and destroy everybody else in Sodom. But instead he's praying that God might spare Sodom because of the presence of righteous people in the city. Abraham mirrors the very heart of God, who does not take any pleasure in destroying the wicked. And as we know, Abraham did not save Sodom, The narrative is brilliantly written because it leaves an unasked and unanswered question hanging in the air. Abraham didn't ask, would you forgive Sodom if there is just one righteous person in the city? And that is the very reality you and I have experienced. It is because of the righteousness of one person that you and I have experienced forgiveness. As Keller points out, if Abraham had asked, would you say for the sake of one? God's answer would have been, yes, if it's the right one. Amen.